You really need to witness someone's face when their entire world shatters in a matter of seconds. That's exactly what I saw when the screaming HOA Karen, who had been making our lives miserable at the mountain cabin for months, finally ran into someone she couldn't intimidate. This woman truly believed she held all the power, waving official-looking documents, making demands, and threatening us with consequences. But the moment my wife calmly handed her an envelope, I saw this so-called authority figure freeze, as if she had just stared death in the eyes. And let me tell you, this story only gets wilder from here. To explain how it all began, let me rewind a little. I'm Wesley Armstrong, and about 6 months ago my wife, Megan, and I moved into a beautiful mountain community in Colorado, believing it would be the peaceful retirement we had always dreamed about. After 25 years as a journalist digging into political scandals and corruption, I was ready for quiet. Megan, who built her career as a successful property lawyer handling real estate disputes, was ready to put her legal battles behind her. We had saved for decades to buy this dream log cabin surrounded by towering pines, with a view so breathtaking every morning felt like a vacation. At first, it was everything we hoped for: no deadlines, no office politics, just the two of us finally enjoying the life we'd earned. I took on freelance travel writing, while Megan set aside her legal work to focus on gardening and her mystery novels. The neighbors seemed welcoming to mostly fellow retirees who, like us, had chosen the quiet life of the mountains over the noise of the city. We waved at people on our morning walks, exchanged small talk at the local grocery store, and felt certain we had found our little paradise. But that peace lasted only 3 weeks. It was on a crisp September morning when the calm cracked. I was sipping coffee on the porch, watching the aspens turn golden, when a white SUV pulled up our driveway. Out stepped a woman who looked every bit the part of an official navy blazer, khaki slacks, clipboard in hand, walking with the confidence of someone who believed she belonged everywhere. She introduced herself as Chloe Foster from the Mountain Community Standards Board, claiming she was there for a routine property inspection. Her polished demeanor and laminated ID badge made the whole act seem convincing, at least at first. She had forms clipped neatly to her board, a county-style lanyard, and an air of authority. But something about her felt off. Maybe it was my journalist instincts, or maybe it was the way she scanned our cabin like she was memorizing every corner. When I looked closer at her badge, subtle flaws jumped out. The font was slightly wrong, the expiration date had already passed, and the department title she claimed didn't match any real county office I knew of. Just then, Megan came outside, drying her hands on a towel, and immediately gave Chloe the kind of polite but guarded smile she reserved for pushy salespeople. Chloe launched into a long-winded explanation about verifying our cabin's paint color for historical and neighborhood consistency. She snapped photos of our plates, wrote down our house number, and peppered us with questions about when we bought the property and what changes we'd made. Every answer she gave was vague, every detail rehearsed, as if she'd performed this routine many times before. After 20 minutes, she handed over paperwork that looked legitimate on the surface, instructing us to provide proof our paint color complied with historical guidelines. She added that fines might follow if we didn't meet requirements and promised to return within a week. The whole thing felt surreal. Our community had no HOA, no strict covenants, yet here we were, being threatened over paint. As she walked back to her SUV, I noticed the magnetic logo on her door was crooked and peeling at the corner, another tiny detail my reporter brain filed away. The second her car disappeared down the road, Megan's lawyer instincts went into overdrive. She spread the forms across the table, scanning every word with the intensity of someone dissecting a courtroom exhibit. After a long silence, she finally said, "Wesley, these aren't just suspicious. They're identical to the forged documents I saw in a Denver corruption case 2 years ago. That defendant hadn't signed help a blank county form sold straight to scammers." Her eyes were sharp with concern. If someone is using real county templates, it means they have access to official systems. This isn't some amateur playing dress up. Her words sent a familiar chill through me. Back in my reporting days, that feeling always meant the story was bigger, darker, and far more dangerous than it first appeared. That evening, as the sun painted the mountains purple and gold, Megan sat quiet, staring at the paperwork. "You know what unsettles me the most?" she finally whispered. She knew exactly which questions to ask, which forms to bring, and how to act like a true authority. Someone taught her this routine, someone with real county knowledge. I nodded, remembering countless corruption scandals that began just this way, innocent on the surface until you realized the whole system was being manipulated. Before we went inside for the night, Megan's eyes locked on mine. "These aren't fake templates, Wesley. They're copies of the real thing. Someone with system clearance made these." The only question I saw who. By morning, our quiet routine was shattered again. Instead of sipping coffee on the porch, Megan was glued to her laptop, frantically checking our bank accounts. "Wesley," she said, her voice tight, "we have a serious problem. Our property tax has just been flagged for review, and there are 3 new bills in the mailbox I've never seen before." Less than a day after close so-called inspection, our financial world was suddenly under siege from every direction. And what made it terrifying was how official every single document looked. These weren't the kind of fake bills you'd expect from a lazy scammer. They looked professional documents that could easily pass for legitimate notices. The financial assault came fast, coordinated, and frighteningly effective. First, we got a call from the utility company. They said our property had been flagged for an environmental compliance review by someone claiming to represent county oversight. To continue our service, we would need to pay a $500 inspection fee. The representative even apologized, but insisted the request originated from official county records and their hands were tied. Then came a notice from something calling itself the Mountain Regional Water Authority. It demanded $200 for a connection fee supposedly overlooked during our move-in. By lunchtime, we were staring at additional bills for septic inspection, environmental impact studies, and so-called community infrastructure fees stacking up to more than $1,500. What made these demands dangerous was how cleverly they exploited our newness to the area. We had no frame of reference for what was normal versus what was suspicious. Each bill carried convincing letterheads, polished bureaucratic language, and reference numbers that looked authentic. The charges were high enough to hurt, but not outrageous enough to seem impossible. The real trap was the deadline as a short, urgent, and always accompanied by threats of service interruptions or legal action. The goal was obvious: push us to pay quickly rather than question anything. The psychological effect was exactly what the attackers intended. We felt overwhelmed and confused, drowning in a maze of bureaucracy we couldn't navigate. The stress was crushing, and it was wearing on Megan in ways I had never seen before. This was the woman who had spent her career dismantling complex cases without blinking. Yet here, under the weight of official-looking harassment and constant financial pressure, I saw real panic creeping in. Sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by the growing pile of bills, she admitted, "I know how to fight battles in the courtroom, but this feels different, like trying to grab fog. Every time I think I've caught something solid, it slips through my fingers and takes another shape." The uncertainty was worse than the costs. We could pay the bills if we had HOA, but we didn't know if paying would end the harassment or just fuel it further. Even more disturbing was how this entire scheme seemed designed to cut us off from any normal support systems. When Megan called the county offices to verify some of the charges, officials told her the departments listed didn't even exist. But then she'd get follow-up calls from people pretending to represent those exact departments. When I tried digging into the supposed companies behind the bills, their websites looked polished at first glance, but tiny inconsistencies gave them away. Phone numbers routed to voicemail systems, addresses didn't trace back to real offices. Every attempt to fact-check only spun us deeper into confusion. By the end of the week, it was clear this was no longer simple harassment. It had escalated into something closer to economic warfare. Our mortgage company reached out, saying someone had filed a property dispute that could interfere with future refinancing. Our insurance agent flagged irregularities in our policy that required urgent attention and new documentation. Even our internet provider got dragged in after a mysterious complaint forced a review of our account, threatening to cut off service. It felt like every financial relationship we had was under coordinated attack, orchestrated by people who knew exactly how to twist bureaucratic systems to maximize chaos without leaving a clear trail. The mental toll was brutal. Instead of enjoying our retirement, we spent every waking hour scrambling to deal with financial crises, too overwhelmed to think clearly about who was behind it all. The non-stop cycle of unexpected bills, aggressive phone calls, and looming deadlines left us constantly reacting instead of investigating, and that was the point. Whoever was behind this wanted us too exhausted and distracted to step back and see the bigger pattern. That evening, after yet another day lost to phone calls and paperwork, Megan finally looked at me with frustration written across her fascia. Broken bar. Whoever's behind this knows exactly how to keep us so busy putting out fires that we never have time to figure out who's actually starting them, Megan muttered after yet another day spent buried in calls and paperwork. The harassment hit its peak when our mortgage company phoned with news that made the scope of the attack unmistakable. Someone had filed a property dispute, challenging our legal ownership of the cabin. The representative was polite, but firmer regulations required them to freeze our equity until the matter was resolved, no matter how baseless the claim might be. As I hung up, I saw Megan's hands trembling around her coffee cup. That was the moment it clicked. We weren't simply dealing with financial harassment anymore. This was a calculated attempt to strip away our security and control over our own lives. That evening, as we sat on the deck staring into the fading light, my old investigative instincts kicked back in. This wasn't bad luck, it wasn't red tape, it was deliberate, too precise, too organized, and perfectly timed. Whoever was behind this had intimate knowledge of rural financial systems and was systematically exploiting every loophole to unleash maximum damage. Megan, I said, watching her pore over yet another stack of threatening letters, this feels personal, like someone who knows exactly where to strike, and is doing it with purpose. She looked up, her exhaustion edged with anger, and in that moment, I could see her mindset shifting. The lawyer in her, who had once dismantled powerful opponents in court, was starting to move from defense to offense. The realization was chilling and empowering at the same time. It meant we weren't just the unlucky targets of bureaucracy, we were under attack by an actual person or group, someone with resources, someone with intent. And if there was a person behind it, then they could be uncovered, confronted, and ultimately beaten. Later that night, as we got ready for bed, I noticed Megan jotting down notes tracking the timing of bills, the patterns of phone calls, the escalation of claims. Wesley, she said softly, I think I know who might be able to help us, but it'll take time to build a real case. She paused, fixing me with the same sharp focus I'd seen her use in high-stakes trials. I asked her the question that had been nagging me for days. Megan, a broken bar, how did you know exactly what to ask them? What aren't you telling me? We didn't have long to dwell on it. By the third week of October, Chloe shifted gears. Gone were the fake inspectors and bogus bills. Instead, she found a new weapon: our own neighbors. And this tactic cut deeper than anything else we'd faced. She began holding what she called community safety meetings, where she painted Megan and me as problem residents, outsiders who disrespected mountain values and threatened the peace of the neighborhood. We wouldn't even have known about the first meeting if Deputy Frank Brooks, our neighbor and the local sheriff's deputy, hadn't stopped by. He looked uneasy, scratching at his neck as he spoke. Look, I don't know what's really going on here, but Chloe's been showing folks some convincing evidence that you two are causing trouble. Might be a good idea if you came down and saw for yourselves. That evening, we walked into the community center and were stunned. Nearly 30 of our neighbors were crowded into the small meeting room, the biggest gathering we'd seen since moving there. And at the front stood Chloe, clipboard in hand, a portable projector glowing beside her. She radiated authority, every inch the concerned community organizer. Her presentation was a masterclass in psychological manipulation disguised as civic duty. She showed photographs of Megan trespassing on nearby land when in reality she was simply walking our own boundaries to learn the property lines. Then came shots of me harassing neighbors, pictures taken while I was interviewing residents about the financial harassment campaign. Every innocent action we'd taken was twisted into damning evidence of us being disruptive outsiders who didn't respect the values of mountain living. And the most devastating part? The way she framed it all. A broken Barclay delivered her accusations with such convincing emotion that many neighbors nodded in agreement, trading uneasy glances as if her words carried undeniable truth. She was a natural performer, skilled at exploiting the mistrust rural communities often harbor toward outsiders or professionals from bigger cities who might seem arrogant. What made her campaign especially dangerous was that she mixed lies with fragments of truth just enough to make her narrative believable. Yes, Megan had asked questions about county procedures, but only because we were being bombarded with fake official documents. Yes, I had spoken to neighbors, but that was part of investigating whether others were facing similar harassment. Yes, we had taken photos and kept records, because anyone building a case against organized fraud would do the same. But in close, carefully staged presentation, all these reasonable actions were twisted into evidence that we were disruptive outsiders stirring up trouble. She painted us as paranoid city dwellers incapable of fitting into small-town life, stirring up conflict where none existed. The most chilling part was how easily many of our neighbors accepted her version of events without question. By the end of that meeting, our once welcoming community stood divided. Roughly half the residents now saw us as suspicious intruders, while the others looked unsettled but uncertain about what to believe. Even Frank Brooks, the local deputy who had always seemed fair-minded, appeared shaken by close so-called evidence, though he tried to keep order. When the meeting ended, I noticed the cold stares, the hushed whispers, and the deliberate avoidance as people passed us. In one night, Chloe had managed to recast us from new neighbors into community outcasts. The change was immediate and painful. Friendly waves on our morning walks turned into suspicious glares. Light-hearted conversations at the store became stiff exchanges, or vanished altogether. Megan, normally confident and social, grew quiet and guarded. I began doubting every word I spoke, worried that each interaction confirmed Chloe's lies. Our dream home in the mountains now felt like hostile territory. What cut the deepest was realizing how Chloe had turned the very values that had drawn us to this place into weapons against USA community loyalty, wariness of outside interference, respect for tradition. All of them were used to isolate us. In the days that followed, the divide only grew sharper. Neutral neighbors began choosing sides, and far too many chose hers. The grocer who once greeted us warmly now barely offered polite words. Friends stopped calling, and worst of all, some residents began spreading stories to back up Chloe's narrative, claiming we had made them uncomfortable or acted suspiciously. Life felt like living under constant surveillance, as if every move we made was being judged and reported. But just when things seemed unbearable, we found a small but vital ally in Hannah. Unlike the others, she saw through Chloe's tactics. One evening, she arrived with her laptop, determination written all over her face. "I've been tracking everything," she said, showing us screenshots and recordings of Chloe's meetings. "And Wesley, I think I found something important." Hannah had been quietly fact-checking Chloe's so-called evidence and discovered several glaring problems. Photos taken from impossible angles, timestamps that didn't match weather records, GPS data placing the photographer in locations inaccessible by road or trail. "This isn't just exaggeration," Hannah explained. "She's manufacturing fake evidence to support her lies." To his credit, Deputy Brooks took Hannah's findings seriously. Following procedure, he documented the irregularities and filed an official report with the sheriff's office for possible fraud and harassment. But even as we built a case against Chloe, the damage she had inflicted on our reputation lingered. The mountain community we had worked so hard to join was now fractured, wary, and divided, and we were still fighting to prove we weren't the villains she had made us out to be. The constant pressure was wearing us down, and I could see Megan struggling with the kind of helpless anger that comes from being relentlessly smeared by someone who, on the surface, looked more believable than we did. Then came the blow that changed everything. Just days after Frank filed his report, Megan received a letter from the State Bar Association. Someone had submitted a detailed complaint accusing her of harassing officials and neighbors, supposedly violating professional ethics. As she read the document, her hands trembled. "Wesley," she whispered, fear written across her face, "whoever wrote this knows things about my past cases that were never public. They know confidential client details, private settlement negotiations, even internal firm conversations from years ago." She stared at the letter as if it were venomous. How could anyone possibly have access to information that private? While Megan faced an attack on her career and law license, I turned back to the only weapon I trusted: investigative journalism. Decades in the field had taught me how to trace paper trails, connect scattered dots, and see the bigger picture behind what seemed like isolated events. What I uncovered was far more alarming than a personal vendetta. We weren't just being harassed, we were caught up in a deliberate campaign that had been targeting rural communities across Colorado for years. Our nightmare was only one skirmish in a broader war aimed at families with the knowledge and means to challenge corruption. I started by reviewing property records in our county and nearby mountain towns. A disturbing pattern emerged: families with professional backgrounds, lawyers, teachers, journalists, and others who would buy homes in these areas, only to be bombarded by escalating harassment and financial pressure. Within months, they'd sell at steep losses, driven out before they could settle in. Soon after, development firms or investment groups snapped up the properties at bargain prices. This wasn't random chance. The same story repeated across county lines. Always the same arc: harassment, forced sales, cheap acquisitions. The consistency pointed to something organized. It looked like someone was identifying educated professionals, people likely to push back against corruption, and systematically driving them away. Using my old press contacts and research tools, I began assembling the timeline of these property flips and the harassment that preceded them. The evidence painted a clear picture of a coordinated criminal network, operating for at least 3 years, generating millions through forced turnovers of rural land. But the deeper I dug, the harder the resistance became. My investigation was being sabotaged. Phone calls to trusted colleagues were mysteriously interrupted or canceled. Research databases that had never failed me suddenly threw up error messages when I searched specific records. Sources who initially agreed to speak would call back within hours, anxious and apologetic, saying local officials had warned them to back off. Someone was tracking my work in real time, shutting down leads the moment I touched them. The sophistication suggested serious resources and inside connections, but the desperation only convinced me I was closing in on the truth. Even public county records became strangely inaccessible, system maintenance warnings and temporary restrictions popping up only when I searched certain properties or dates. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a battle of information, and whoever was behind it was willing to burn every bridge to keep the truth buried. When I tried speaking with families who had been pressured into selling their mountain homes, I discovered most of them were bound by non-disclosure agreements. These legal clauses, buried in their sale contracts, silenced them from ever talking about the harassment or the circumstances that had forced them out. What made the sabotage so maddening was how it weaponized real procedures to hide behind. Public record requests weren't denied outright, they were tied up in endless backlogs or verification checks that only seemed to apply to me. Interviews I carefully scheduled would collapse overnight, with sudden family emergencies or last-minute conflicts. Database searches would crash right when I needed them most, hidden behind conveniently timed security updates or maintenance windows. Whoever was behind this knew exactly how to use bureaucracy as a smokescreen, a maximum disruption with no obvious fingerprints. Even through the obstruction, I pieced together the bones of the scheme. It worked like this: identify high-value rural properties owned by residents considered problems of the kind of people who had the skills or courage to expose corruption, then unleash a campaign blending fake government pressure, targeted financial stress, and community rumor-mongering until the owners cracked and sold cheap. Once driven out, those properties passed quickly into the hands of developers with county connections, who then used expedited permits and approvals to cash in through new projects. It wasn't random harassment, it was a real estate laundering machine fueled by harassment, intimidation, and backroom deals. At the center of it all were corrupt county officials. They had the inside knowledge of what properties were rising in value, who might resist development, who had the kind of background that threatened to shine a light on shady deals. Lawyers, journalists, teachers, people like us. And before those people could establish themselves, the harassment would begin. From the outside, it all looked like normal government actions or concerned neighbors, but beneath the surface, it was an orchestrated conspiracy. Frank Brooks became critical in this stage of our fight. As deputy sheriff, he had the access to confirm details I couldn't reach on my own. He carefully documented Hannah's evidence of close activities and filed it properly through the sheriff's office. But even Frank admitted the challenge. They're clever, he told me. Everything they do stays just inside the law. The paperwork looks official enough to fool anyone. The financial threats trace back to agencies that seem legitimate. And the community meetings, they prey on real fears about property values. Where my research exposed the broad strokes, Frank's perspective showed the machinery inside the system, county officials with the authority to grease the wheels and keep the harassment invisible. Then came Megan's revelation, and suddenly, everything made sense. One evening, as we sat at the table surrounded by files and half-finished notes, she looked at me with that razor-sharp courtroom expression I remembered from her trial days. "Wesley," she said evenly, "I didn't wait for Frank's inquiry to run its course. 3 weeks ago, when I recognized these patterns from my old corruption cases, I contacted federal investigators. I've been building a case for them ever since. Local law enforcement can't touch something this organized, but the feds can." Her words hit me like a hammer. It explained why our harassment had spiked in intensity, why my investigation was being cut off at every turn. We weren't just unlucky targets, so we had stumbled into the middle of a federal corruption probe. And now, without realizing it, we were part of the trap. "The warrant is ready," Megan continued, her voice steady, unflinching. "Tomorrow, this ends. We're going to spring the net and bring the entire network down." A wave of pride and fear hit me at the same time. Pride at her brilliance and courage, a fear at the scale of the storm we were walking into. "Megan," I asked quietly, searching her face, "what kind of danger are we in if it takes federal agents to finish this?" The next morning, she was already dressed in her sharpest professional suit, moving through her preparations with the calm efficiency of someone who had waited her entire life for this moment. Megan moved through her morning routine with the precision of someone ready to execute a carefully laid plan. On the kitchen counter sat a sealed manila envelope, positioned with the weight of a weapon waiting for its purpose. "Wesley," she said, glancing at her watch with practiced composure, "in just a few hours, you'll see exactly what happens when weeks of preparation for a federal sting finally come together." Her tone radiated absolute confidence, though beneath it lingered a tension that made it clear the confrontation ahead carried both danger and finality. But before that pivotal moment arrived, we had to endure one last public humiliation, a proof of just how deeply close manipulations had poisoned our standing in the community. It unfolded inside Miller's General Store, the small mountain shop where locals not only bought supplies but exchanged news, weather updates, and friendly banter. I was there gathering items Megan had vaguely described as part of our final preparations when Chloe appeared. Her entrance had the dramatic timing of someone who had been waiting for the perfect opportunity. Well, she declared loudly enough for every shopper to hear, "if it isn't our troublemaking city lawyer and his journalist husband, probably here to spy on honest mountain folk and twist their words for their big city agenda." Her casual tone was a mask. The volume and timing were calculated for maximum embarrassment. Dozens of eyes shifted toward us, and the looks I saw carried suspicion, doubt, and discomfort. The faces that had once greeted us with warmth now seemed conflicted. Chloe had chosen her battlefield perfectly, a public place where escape was impossible, and the crowd was her stage. What followed was less a conversation and more a performance. She cast us as villains, accusing us of undermining mountain values, harassing officials, and turning neighbors against each other. Her voice rose with each accusation, and the signs of her unraveling began to show with a white-knuckle grip on her clipboard, the flush spreading across her face, the cracks forming in her carefully controlled demeanor. The effect was polarizing. Roughly half the onlookers nodded along, buying into her narrative. The rest looked unsettled as her anger crossed the line from firm conviction into something more unhinged. Friends I had once trusted exchanged uneasy glances, torn between the authority figure they had been conditioned to respect and the unsettling reality playing out before them. Then the dynamic shifted. Deputy Sheriff Frank Brooks entered the store, his uniform alone enough to change the atmosphere. In a calm, professional tone, he said, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to lower your voice and conduct yourself appropriately in this business." Instead of backing down, Chloe turned her fury on him. "Don't you dare tell me how to conduct myself," she shouted, her voice bouncing off the walls. "I'm protecting this community from outsiders who want to destroy everything we've built." The collapse of her authority was almost surreal. Months of manipulation and control disintegrated into raw hysteria. She waved her clipboard like a weapon, spit flying as she ranted. "I'm the only one who understands what's happening here. These city people with their lawyers, their questions, their investigations, they're trying to tear apart our home, and I'm the only one with the courage to stop them." The transformation was so extreme that some shoppers instinctively stepped back, unsettled by the sheer intensity of her breakdown. Frank calmly documented her every word and action, while Hannah, who had slipped in unnoticed, recorded the entire scene. Neighbors who once trusted Chloe stood frozen, watching the mask fall away. The contrast between her polished, authoritative persona and the unrestrained zealot in front of them was undeniably. Even her most loyal supporters looked uneasy, some even embarrassed to be associated with her. And then came the moment that sealed it. Chloe, red-faced and trembling with rage, pointed directly at us and shouted. Chloe's hands trembled as she tried to reassert control, her voice shaking but defiant. "I'm bringing real authority to shut this circus down once and for all. You people picked the wrong person to challenge, and now you'll learn what happens when you go up against someone with true connections and real power." Amid her tirade, she made a critical mistake. In a burst of desperation, she dialed someone on her phone, seemingly forgetting that every word carried clearly through the store. "Ray, it's collapsing here," she pleaded, her tone panicked. "These people won't listen anymore, and now the deputy is siding against me. You promised you could control this, but I need backup immediately." That one slip gave us our first concrete link to whoever was supporting her operation. The way she spoke made it obvious that this Ray wasn't just a casual contact. He was someone with real influence, someone she trusted to intervene when her manipulations failed. The fallout from Chloe's breakdown came swiftly. Neighbors who had once backed her began approaching us, uneasy and apologetic, whispering concerns about her erratic behavior. Frank Brooks filed an official report, carefully noting her threats and increasingly unstable conduct, framing her actions as more than just advocacy. They now bordered on criminal intimidation. Most importantly, the artificial consensus she had built over months of manipulation began to crumble. People had seen for themselves the fanaticism hiding under her polished mask, and it shook their trust. That evening, as Megan prepared what she promised would be the final step, I felt both relief and dread. Chloe's mention of Ray, a man with real connections, made it clear this fight was no longer confined to local corruption. We were up against something far more powerful. Yet there was also a sense of finality in the air, as if everything was converging toward one decisive moment. "Megan," I asked, watching her seal the envelope with deliberate care, "what exactly are you planning to hand her?" The next morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of mountain dawn where every sound and detail feels sharper. Megan was already dressed, her navy suit pressed, her white blouse spotless, and her pearl earrings, the same ones she wore for her most important courtroom battle, glinting in the morning light. Her every movement was precise, like she was stepping through a carefully rehearsed performance. On the counter sat the sealed manila envelope, waiting like a silent weapon. Federal agents had taken their positions before sunrise, unseen but ready. Megan checked her watch once more and turned to me. "Wesley, in less than half an hour, you'll see what happens when someone who has spent months perfecting a scam walks right into a federal trap." Right on schedule, Chloe's SUV climbed the mountain road. This time she wasn't alone. A convoy followed, the three men in county-style uniforms, a woman with a clipboard and camera, and a man introducing himself as a regional compliance supervisor. Behind them, two more vehicles marked with county insignia completed the show of power. As they approached, Chloe's demeanor was transformed. The screaming zealot from last night had vanished, replaced by the polished authority figure she'd always pretended to be. Calm and commanding, she radiated confidence, convinced that this was the day she would finally crush the outsiders who had defied her. "Mr. and Mrs. Armstrong," she declared with icy professionalism, "this is your final chance to comply with county standards and avoid further legal action." She gestured toward her entourage, each clutching official-looking clipboards and stacks of documents. "We are here to conduct an emergency compliance review and, if necessary, initiate immediate remediation of your property." Her tone left no doubt this was meant to be her grand victory, the moment where we surrendered to her staged authority. But Megan stepped forward, steady and unshaken, the same calm energy she carried into courtrooms before dismantling an opponent. "Actually, Chloe," she said, voice sharp but measured, "I have some documentation for you." She lifted the manila envelope with both hands, offering it as though she were submitting evidence before a judge. The motion was deliberate, almost ceremonial. And in that poised delivery, it was clear, this moment hadn't just been anticipated, it had been orchestrated. Chloe's eyes lit with smug satisfaction as she reached for the envelope, clearly convinced that Megan's gesture was an admission of surrender. To her, this was the moment when the stubborn outsiders finally bowed to her authority. "Finally," she said, brimming with self-satisfaction, some cooperation and respect for legitimate power. But the second she opened the envelope, everything shifted. I watched her expression collapse in stages, triumph turning into confusion, confusion into disbelief, and disbelief into raw terror. At first, she just stared blankly, as if her brain couldn't process what she was reading. Then the blood drained from her face, leaving her ghostly pale. Her hands trembled so violently that the papers shook, before she dropped her clipboard onto the porch with a hollow clatter. Stumbling backward into one of her officials, she could only whisper, her voice cracking, "What a broken bar, what is this?" Megan's reply was sharp and cold. "A federal arrest warrant," she said, with the calm authority of someone explaining the obvious to a child. "Chloe Foster, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, impersonating government officials, and violating federal anti-corruption statutes." The moment the words left Megan's lips, the quiet morning erupted. Real FBI agents emerged from hidden positions around our property, moving with flawless precision. The so-called county officials who had accompanied Chloe tried to scatter but were instantly surrounded by federal officers who had been waiting for this moment. Frank Brooks appeared alongside them, working with the federal team to secure the area. Chloe's reaction wasn't the meltdown I had expected. Instead, she shifted gears into survival mode, showing the calculating criminal beneath her zealot's mask. "I want to speak to my lawyer immediately," she demanded, her voice still shaking but steady enough to show she was already thinking ahead. "And I want to discuss cooperation and reduced charges." Then she dropped her bombshell. "I can give you Ray Donnelly," she blurted. "County Commissioner Ray Donnelly, he's the one who planned everything. I have documents, recordings, bank transfers. I was just following his orders." The name landed like a thunderclap. Suddenly it all made sense. The polish of her operation, the insider access, the official resources she had at her disposal. Federal agents exchanged sharp glances, clearly recognizing the name and its weight within their broader investigation. "We'll discuss your cooperation," the lead agent told her as they cuffed her. "But first, we secure the scene." As they led Chloe to a waiting vehicle, she turned back, fear etched across her face. "You don't understand," she cried. "Ray has contingency plans. He'll wipe everything, evidence, money, all of Ita, and disappear within hours. You have to move fast." Even as she and her imposter officials were taken away, the sense of victory was tempered by unease. Agents quickly locked down our property as a crime scene, working alongside Frank to prevent any interference. Frank explained that they had been tracking a multi-county corruption ring for months, and our ordeal had given them the evidence to launch a sweeping operation. Megan then revealed she had been feeding the feds information for weeks of files, documents, recordings, all of which had helped them secure multiple arrest warrants across several counties. The scale was staggering. This wasn't just about our little mountain community. It was part of a sprawling network that preyed on rural towns, weaponizing fake authority and real corruption to force families off their land and funnel profits into shadowy development schemes. Relief mingled with apprehension as I watched Chloe's false authority dissolve under the weight of real federal power. For the first time, it felt like the nightmare was ending. But just as calm seemed to settle in, every phone in the house went dead. All at once, every device around us went silent. Hannah's emergency live stream froze mid-sentence, and even the federal agents' radios began to sputter with interference. A blanket of silence fell across the mountain as communications collapsed. County trucks had already begun to block the main roads, sealing off our exits. It was then I realized that Ray Donnelly had no intention of surrendering quietly. "If he can disrupt federal communications," I murmured to Megan, watching the agents frown at their malfunctioning gear, "what else has he prepared?" It was one of those chilling moments when you suddenly recognize that your enemy is far more dangerous than you imagined. But this wasn't the flawless scheme of a criminal genius, it was the desperate move of a cornered man. Donnelly had maybe 2 or 3 hours before reinforcements could bypass the jammers. He was using portable signal blockers and emergency county protocols to stall for a time to burn evidence or vanish completely. Yet instead of fleeing, his hatred for Megan outweighed his instincts for survival. With the little window he had left, he wanted vengeance. The lead federal agent, a firm woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Special Agent Morgan, quickly gathered us inside the kitchen while her team scrambled to set up backup communications. She laid out the chilling backstory that had led us here. 2 years ago, she began, your wife exposed a fraudulent land scheme in Jefferson County that cost Ray Donnelly about $3 million in lost development deals. At the time, he was the county commissioner, approving illegal permits for construction companies in exchange for hefty kickbacks. When Mrs. Armstrong's investigation led to federal charges and his removal from office, he swore revenge. She opened a thick file stuffed with documents. We've been monitoring him for a year and a half. He's moved county to county, setting up new networks of corruption, and he's made it a mission to target lawyers and professionals who could expose him. What makes him especially dangerous is that his grudge against your wife isn't just professional, it's personal. It's consumed him. The file revealed months of obsessive research, Megan's career, her past cases, even our personal lives and retirement plans. He had found our cabin purchased through real estate records and had been plotting this harassment long before we moved to Colorado. This wasn't random, Agent Morgan stressed. He deliberately chose this community knowing you were moving here. He recruited Chloe Foster, built a network of accomplices, and staged everything to break you down. Chloe's cooperation with investigators was already proving invaluable, offering disturbing insights into Donnelly's state of mind. She described how his fixation with destroying Megan had grown darker and more detailed, how he fantasized about dismantling our marriage, draining our savings, and stripping away every ounce of peace we had. He didn't just want you gone, Agent Morgan said gravely. He wanted you ruined, financially, professionally, personally. He wanted to see you lose everything the way he lost everything. The scale of his planning was terrifying. He had built layers of backup strategies, contingencies for any legal counter, and an entire ring of corrupt allies ready to keep the pressure on for years. But with his empire collapsing, his judgment was slipping. Rage was guiding him now. Instead of fleeing, Donnelly was plotting a direct confrontation. We believe, Agent Morgan warned Megan, that he intends to force a face-to-face encounter. Our intelligence shows he sees this as his last chance to confront the woman who ended his career. Her words explained the nightmare we had endured. This hadn't just been about money or power. Every legal threat, every manipulated neighbor, every financial squeeze, it had all been crafted as psychological warfare. Donnelly wanted Megan to suffer in the same way he had suffered, stripped of control, crushed under a weight of fear and hopelessness. This was never just corruption. It was vengeance, methodical, personal, and devastating. What shook us most during the federal briefing wasn't just Ray's obsession with Megan, it was discovering how many others had already fallen victim to his schemes. Agent Morgan explained that across several counties, Donnelly had driven out at least 8 different families, all using the same ruthless strategies. His chosen targets were never random. He went after lawyers, journalists, and educators, people with the skills or platforms to uncover corruption. Each attack was crafted to exploit personal weaknesses. Families with little savings faced crushing financial pressure. Professionals who depended on their reputation were threatened with public disgrace. Those who had moved to rural areas searching for connection were isolated and turned against by their own communities. Donnelly had refined the art of psychological warfare until it was almost scientific. But his fixation on Megan had pushed him too far. If he had been satisfied with running us out through intimidation and money games, he might have succeeded and stayed hidden. Instead, his thirst for revenge had dragged him into federal crimes, exposing his alliances and giving investigators the proof they needed to collapse his entire operation. Your case became the turning point, Agent Morgan told us. His obsession made him reckless, and that gave us the evidence to dismantle his network across 6 counties. The scale of what we'd stumbled into was staggering. We weren't just unlucky residents caught in rural corruption, we had been deliberately chosen as the centerpiece of one man's vendetta. And yet, by being his focus, we had also become the key to ending his larger empire. His hatred made him dangerous, but it also made him predictable. As Morgan coordinated with her team through backup communication systems, the phones in our cabin suddenly rang at once. Megan picked up and froze. On the other end was Ray himself. "You destroyed my career, counselor." His voice hissed, steady but dripping with venom. "I'll give you one chance. Meet me alone and apologize. Otherwise, your husband pays the price." When the line went dead, Megan turned to me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Real fear. "What did I do to him that was so unforgivable?" she whispered. That call shifted everything. This was no longer just an investigation. It had become a personal hostage situation with my life as the bargaining chip. Agent Morgan immediately began crafting a controlled response, but Donnelly's ultimatum made the situation volatile. "Mrs. Armstrong," she said firmly, "we will never ask you to meet the violent suspect alone, but I understand you may feel the need to protect your husband." Her team worked quickly, developing alternatives, hidden surveillance, tactical cover, negotiation angles. But Donnelly's demand for a one-on-one meeting meant that if the feds were involved, it had to be invisible, flawless, and immediate. Megan agreed, her resolve as sharp as ever. "He won't touch Wesley if he believes I'm willing to face him. But if he senses a setup, he'll lose control completely, and that's far more dangerous." Against her better judgment, Agent Morgan approved the plan. Megan would wear a wire while tactical teams waited nearby. The goal was simply keep Megan alive, catch Donnelly's words on record, and secure enough evidence to charge every last member of his network. But Hannah and I weren't willing to just sit back. While the feds set their trap, we created one of our own. Using Hannah's tech skills and my background in journalism, we prepared a broadcast system that couldn't be erased. "If this goes sideways," Hannah said, setting up hidden cameras and linking multiple live streams, "the world will see it in real time. No one can bury it." The meeting spot Ray chose revealed everything about his mindset. He demanded Megan meet him in the same community center where Chloe had staged her fraudulent gatherings. It was empty, isolated, and unbeknownst to him surrounded by places the agents could use for cover. To Ray, it was the perfect stage for his symbolic victory. To us, it was an exposed battlefield. When Megan walked through the doors that night, she found Ray waiting with 2 armed men, a clearly hired muscle, not officials. He looked nothing like the polished commissioner he once was. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, his face drawn with sleepless hatred. He was a man hollowed out by obsession. Through Hannah's hidden feeds, we watched the confrontation unfold. This wasn't a measured negotiation, it was the eruption of years of bottled rage. "You destroyed everything I had," Ray spat, his voice trembling but venomous. "Power, money, respect, a future worth millions. And you stole it with your crusade against corruption." As his fury boiled over, his carefully guarded secrets began spilling out, and not as a confession, but as the bitter justifications of a man who had lost everything and needed someone to blame. Ray's tirade slipped from arrogance into pitiful self-justification. What made it invaluable to the federal team wasn't just that he admitted guilt, it was that he revealed the blueprint of his corruption empire. "You don't get it?" he ranted, pacing the empty community center like a wild animal in a cage. "Small towns don't care about your federal red tape, your fancy lawyers, or your so-called ethics. They want jobs, they want growth, they want progress, and they're willing to work with anyone who can deliver." without waiting on endless paperwork and regulations. He laid out, in startling detail, how he recruited county officials, identified lucrative development projects, and cut through oversight by bending or outright eliminating regulatory hurdles. To him, it wasn't corruption, it was service. But his polished justifications quickly unraveled into venom once he turned his focus back to Megan. "You just couldn't stay in your lane, could you?" he snapped, spit flying as his anger broke through his mask. "You had to be the hero lawyer, the one who saved Colorado. You didn't think about the families you ruined, the people you stole futures from, all because you wanted your name in the paper." The hatred in his voice was so raw, so personal, that it made the room colder. This wasn't about business or politics anymore, it was obsession, a 2-year descent into madness with Megan as the sole target. The confrontation reached a breaking point when his hired guards moved to restrain her. Whatever he had planned as his final act of vengeance was seconds away. But that's when Hannah's live-stream strategy proved priceless. Every word, every threat, every criminal act was already being broadcast in real time to county and state authorities. Multiple agencies deployed emergency response teams instantly. The knowledge that his actions were being publicly exposed shattered what little self-control Ray had left. "I spent 2 years planning this," he shouted, his voice breaking under the weight of fury and desperation. 2 years studying your life, your marriage, your fears. I was going to destroy you piece by piece, until you begged me to stop. By then, federal agents and local law enforcement had the community center surrounded. The combined response crushed his private security like it was nothing. His dream of victory dissolved before his eyes, leaving him with only 2 choices: surrender or go down in a blaze. He chose surrender. As agents cuffed him, the obsession that had fueled him for years seemed to drain away. He looked deflated, broken until he muttered one last threat: "Fine, you got me, but check Mason, Bridger, and Pine Ridge counties. I've got allies there running the same playbook, and they're ready for this day." His arrest ended our personal nightmare, but his final words cracked open a larger truth. We'd only been battling one piece of a far-reaching machine. The next days were a blur of federal raids and arrests. Teams worked non-stop to tear apart the network Ray had exposed, sweeping across 6 counties to seize records, freeze assets, and capture accomplices. But in our small mountain town, recovery began on a different level, and neighbors slowly piecing trust back together. The same community center that had been a battlefield now became a place of healing. People who had once glared at us in suspicion now offered awkward apologies and sincere support. Families realized how thoroughly Chloe and Ray had manipulated their values. Deputy Frank Brooks, once one of Chloe's believers, stepped forward as a surprising leader. He stood before the town and admitted the hard truth. "We all got played," he told the crowd. "They knew exactly how to twist our pride and our fears. That doesn't make us weak, it makes us human. But the fact that we're standing here now, together, rebuilding what they tried to tear down, if that's what makes us strong." His words carried weight because he had lived both sides of falling for the lies and then seen the truth. And for the first time in months, it felt like the community was ready to heal. The federal investigation helped us piece together the bigger picture, but it was the quiet conversations among neighbors that truly began to mend the fractures in our community. In the days after Ray's arrest, people kept coming to our cabana, some offering apologies for believing Chloe's lies, others sharing the financial strain and harassment they had endured, and many asking what they could do to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. Mrs. Carter, one of Chloe's most vocal supporters, showed up with a plate of cookies and tears in her eyes. She confessed how ashamed she felt for fueling our isolation. "I thought I was defending our community," she said softly, "but I was helping tear it apart. They knew exactly how to twist our fears, and I fell for it." Hannah's meticulous documentation became invaluable not only for prosecutors but for the healing of our town. Her recordings of closed meetings, her breakdown of forged documents, and especially the live stream of Ray's unmasking showed everyone that they hadn't just made bad choices, they had been targeted by a deliberate, sophisticated campaign of psychological manipulation designed to turn communities against themselves. This was never about protecting community values, Hannah explained during one gathering. It was about criminals exploiting rural trust, The fastest way to steal from small towns is to convince the townsfolk to destroy anyone who might uncover the theft. Close cooperation with federal agents further exposed how wide the corruption stretched. According to her testimony, Ray's operation had been running across Colorado for years, scouting valuable rural properties, then orchestrating harassment campaigns to force struggling families into selling cheap. Those properties were flipped to developers tied to Ray, raking in massive profits while entire communities unraveled. The cruel genius of the system was that victims often believed they were dealing with real government processes. By the time they realized it was fraud, most were too drained financially and emotionally to fight back. As more arrests rolled in, the sheer scale of the enterprise became clear. Dozens of families across multiple counties robbed, millions in illegal profits uncovered. Yet while federal agents pursued justice on a broad scale, our mountain town focused on something more personal: rebuilding trust and building safeguards. We held community meetings where people learned how to spot fake authority and manufactured official pressure. We set up networks to share information quickly and to respond collectively to suspicious activity. Most importantly, we built a culture of support, promising that no one facing intimidation would ever be left to stand alone again. Megan, once seen as a troublemaker, had become a respected voice of courage. More than that, she found a renewed purpose. One evening, as we sat on the deck watching a sunset free from tension, she turned to me and said, "Wesley, lawyers and advocates from all over Colorado have been reaching out. I think retirement is behind me. I want to use what we've learned to help other towns fight back." Her knowledge of property law, combined with her first-hand experience of being targeted, gave her unique insight and a new calling. Our own healing was slower. Months of fear and isolation had scarred us deeply, testing our marriage and our sense of safety, but it also revealed strengths in each other we hadn't fully known. Even after decades together, one night I admitted, "I never want to live through something like that again, but I'm proud of us." We held on, we didn't give up, and we didn't let them destroy what we built. The impact of what we endured went far beyond our personal victory. Federal investigators began using our case as a model for prosecuting similar schemes nationwide, and our little mountain town became a guidepost for other communities struggling with the same invisible predators. A year after Ray Donnie's downfall, our town was stronger than it had ever been. When a family from another county called asking Megan for help with suspicious community enforcement, she listened with the same careful focus she once reserved for her biggest cases. How many more towns were fighting the same hidden battles? If you faced corrupt officials or fake authority figures, share your story. You might give someone else the knowledge they need to recognize the signs. 1 year after the storm, our community wasn't just surviving, it was thriving, bound tighter than ever by what we had overcome together. The federal investigation eventually wrapped up with convictions across 6 counties. But the true victory was what had happened within our own neighborhood. We'd learned to spot the signs of organized manipulation, built communication systems to flag suspicious official activity, and most importantly created a culture where anyone facing unusual pressure could count on community support instead of suspicion and isolation. The bonds that had formed during the crisis grew into lasting friendships, along with a collective promise to protect one another from future threats. On the legal side, the results were even greater than expected. Ray was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison after prosecutors uncovered evidence that his corruption network had stretched across 8 states, not just Colorado. His assets were seized and liquidated, with the funds distributed to families his schemes had harmed over nearly 4 years. Chloe completed her sentence and, surprisingly, became an ally in the fight for rural protection. Partnering with advocacy groups, she began working to expose the very tactics she once helped implement. Her insider knowledge made her a powerful resource for communities trying to defend themselves, and her genuine remorse gave her work a level of authenticity few others could match. Frank Brooks, promoted to sheriff after his predecessor's early retirement, had earned the community's trust by proving he would put local well-being ahead of outside pressure. One of his first initiatives was to create a regional network of rural law enforcement agencies that shared intelligence and coordinated responses to corruption attempts. These schemes depend on small towns being isolated and uninformed, he explained at a training session. But when rural communities stand together and share information, the system falls apart. Hannah put her investigative instincts and tech skills into building a statewide digital platform to help rural families spot and fight harassment. The platform included databases of known corruption methods, legal resources for families under pressure, and tools for quick community coordination. Within months, it had already prevented 3 harassment campaigns in other counties, a clear proof that what happened to us could become a shield for others. These criminals rely on confusion and isolation, Hannah testified during a state hearing. Our job is to make sure no family has to face them alone. For me, what began as personal writing about our ordeal expanded into a larger project. My book, Mountain Justice: How Rural Communities Fight Back Against Corruption, grew from my articles and became required reading for law enforcement academies and community organizer programs across the Mountain West. More importantly, it reached families in rural areas who needed to hear that they weren't alone and that fighting back was possible. Speaking engagements and consulting followed, giving me the chance to help other communities before they hit the kind of crisis we endured. Megan's second career as a rural corruption consultant took shape as well. She began advising both individual families and entire communities, combining her legal expertise with her lived experience. People trusted her not just because of her knowledge, but because she truly understood what they were going through. The most important thing I tell families, she would explain at her workshops, is that these attacks feel personal, but they're actually predictable business models. Once you recognize the patterns, you can fight back strategically instead of reacting in fear. Her success caught the attention of federal agencies, who began consulting with her on rural crime prevention strategies. As for us, the personal healing took longer than the community's recovery, but in many ways, it left us stronger. The relentless pressure had forced us to lean on each other in ways decades of ordinary marriage never had. We discovered depths of resilience and support that surprised us both. One evening, sitting on the deck, I told her, I never want to go through anything like that again, but I'm grateful it showed us what we're capable of. Together, we realized we could handle almost anything as long as we faced it together. Corruption in rural areas was still a reality, which meant our fight was far from over. But the breakthrough we had achieved became a model for others, offering both hope and a roadmap for future victories. Federal support for rural crime prevention rose significantly after our case revealed just how widespread the problem was. New oversight measures were also introduced to ensure that county officials could no longer run corruption networks unchecked. Even more importantly, small towns across Colorado now had the knowledge and tools to detect harassment early and push back before criminal organizations could take root. The collapse of Ray's operation left a lasting impact on our region's economy. Property values stabilized and began to rise again once the pressure of forced sales disappeared. Development projects now had to go through proper review instead of receiving automatic approvals from corrupt officials. Local businesses flourished, no longer disrupted by constant turnover and conflict. For the first time in years, the mountains felt truly peaceful, along with the reassurance that we were ready to defend that peace if needed. As our third anniversary in the mountains approached, a surprising call reminded us of our continuing mission. It wasn't another distressed family or a worried community, it was the Department of Justice. They wanted Megan to help design a nationwide training program for federal investigators handling rural corruption cases. Mrs. Armstrong, the caller said, your case has set the standard for how these investigations should be run. We need your expertise to help agents understand the unique challenges of rural crime and community dynamics. Knowing that our darkest chapter had become a guidebook for protecting other families was deeply rewarding. At the same time, it reminded us that the battle wasn't finished. Rural America remained vulnerable to sophisticated schemes, and new opportunists would always be ready to exploit isolated communities and trusting residents. But our story had proven that everyday people could fight back successfully if they had the right knowledge, allies, and determination. The network of communities, advocates, and law enforcement that grew from our struggle had created a level of protection rural towns had never seen before. The greatest measure of success wasn't in the convictions, the new policies, or even the satisfaction of bringing down those who tried to destroy us. It was in something far simpler: Families could now move into mountain towns without the shadow of fear. Children could grow up confident that their communities had defenses against outside manipulation and hidden corruption. Retired residents could finally enjoy their years in peace, without worrying that criminals in disguise would steal their savings through elaborate fraud. That evening, as Megan and I sat on the deck, watching the sun sink behind the peaks, we felt something we hadn't in a long time. A young family drove by slowly, clearly exploring the area in search of a home. They waved, and we waved back, knowing they could pursue their dreams without the same fear and uncertainty we had endured in our early days here. "Wesley," Megan asked softly, her eyes following the car down the winding road, "do you think we've made this place safe enough for families like them?" I thought about her question, about everything we had fought for and everything we had built. What if Ray's network was only the beginning? If this story of resilience and justice inspired you, make sure to hit the like button to let Drama Nest know you want more stories of ordinary people standing up to extraordinary challenges. Thank you for watching, and join us in the next episode where another family learns that sometimes the biggest bullies face the biggest surprises. That's the end of Broken Bar, or is it? Drama Nest always has another twist waiting just around the corner. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and stay connected.